Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. All week we have been discussing the way American society has changed over the last 60 years or so. Statistically, less dependence on religion, a weaker family structure, less faith in what our founding fathers passed to us through those documents 250 years ago or so. Whether you think those changes reflect growth and progress or degradation and loss, that, I guess, is a reflection upon individual values, upbringing, and personal selective points of view, I guess. It seems there's a great divide in our country today. At least, that's what we're told so often in the nightly news and from our political leaders. From the media pundits, the outrage, the divide, it seems endless. Now, we're not going to solve the problems of the country with this discussion, but hopefully we can provide a sliver of reason to what otherwise is a very emotional, agenda-driven subject. I'd like to welcome my guest on our show, Dr. Erin Hatton.
Hello.
Welcome to the show. Dr. Hatton, you are a professor of sociology at the Arts and Sciences School at UB.
That's right.
Okay, so you have a background with young people in education. I'll start out by saying it's been said of this generation, the last generation or so, that young people have become more, shall we say, entitled. They think that they're not, well, let's put it this way, they're not as ambitious as past generations. They don't have that work ethic to achieve. Now, is that true, or do you not find that to be the case?
I personally do not find that to be the case. Of course, there's a lot of variation across people, any population, including the young generation and the old generation. But, you know, what I see in young people is a real combination of hard work, of engagement, but also confusion and a little distress, because they're coming into an economy like we haven't seen in quite a long time. There aren't necessarily the jobs there for them, certainly not the quality of jobs they're looking for. So some people might call that entitled, but I think they're a little bit more realistic in some ways. They're facing some dire straits. They can't afford to live in so many of our cities, including, you know, here in Buffalo. Prices are suddenly skyrocketing, and they're looking down the pipeline of their adult lives and feeling some distress. So I definitely wouldn't call it entitled. I would call it confused, hopeful, but also distraught.
Now, are we speaking about just this post-COVID and since the inflation has kicked in, or does it go back further?
Well, I mean, I think the roots are much deeper. I mean, with increasing the rising housing prices, those have been going up for quite some time across the country in many cities. In Buffalo, a little bit more recently than many other places. But increasing costs, decreasing returns to education. So they're doing what they can. They're doing what they've been told that will pay off. But then they're looking at the job market and not sure what they're going to get from it. And so I think they're feeling a little disillusioned. But I definitely wouldn't say entitled or not hardworking. That's not my students at the University of Buffalo. They're very hardworking.
The job market, I know we hear a lot from employers especially that it's hard to find workers today. I'm not sure, I really can't pinpoint why it is, but I hear it from everyone. So it's not just, you know, something that some people talk about. There is real shortage of getting people to come out and take jobs. I don't know whether it's because people got used to stay at home during COVID, or because the government doubled the unemployment and people, you know, it paid to stay home, and maybe that's a residual now of staying home and not working. I just can't put my finger on it, but in fact, the job market is suffering a little bit, you see for help wanted signs everywhere. How do you explain that?
Yeah, my read of it is this. So people are no longer willing to take jobs of the job quality at the pay rate that are being offered.
Okay.
So employers are really feeling, many employers are feeling a crunch, but tellingly not all employers. So the classic example, just we're talking about in COVID times with this economy, UPS has been thriving, whereas many other similar employers in the same sector, in the same sector, have been struggling to find employees, right? And so the key answer there is about the job quality, about the wages, about the benefits that they're offering. And so that's one of the key differences for those jobs that pay really well, that are not too hard.
Does that impact the mom and pop, the smaller businesses? Does that make it really hard to have a business today?
I think it can. I think it can. There's no doubt that employers are struggling in the same way that employees are struggling. And I think COVID also kind of prompted a broad rethinking about the role of work in our lives. So I think workers were no longer willing to just to work without thinking about what they were getting back, what it meant to them, what if their employer really valued them. And I think many discovered that maybe they weren't as valued as they thought they were. And so they weren't going to put up with it anymore.
Well, that kind of reminds me of the debate over minimum wage. As minimum wage goes up, one side will say the smaller businesses can't afford to pay a higher minimum wage because they just, they're working on such a small margin, they won't hire people. And minimum wage is intended for lower qualified workers, unskilled, or young workers fresh out of school to train and give them work experience. And then they will earn more money as they have experience. And so paying a higher minimum wage defeats the purpose of training those young people or giving somebody a second chance, who's down on their luck or whatever. On the other hand, people say, well, you have to have a living wage, and so people deserve more money. There might be a little bit of a false argument when they say you can't support a family on a minimum wage, because most heads of families are not in a position, at least I don't think so, I may be wrong, but most heads of families are not minimum wage workers. They're more experienced, not all, but most of them have more years of experience. So it's a balance. How do you react to the higher minimum wage?
Yeah. I hear what you're saying. Although in theory, the argument may be that a somewhat lower minimum wage might be that kind of stepping stone or training, the reality of it is that many employers pay minimum wage for many different job positions. We may call those unskilled, but in fact, many of those jobs require a great deal of skill. And so that's a bit of a misnomer. And it's also true that, we're not just talking teenagers here. We're not just talking entry-level workers. We're talking people who have worked for many years, are earning minimum wage or close to it, and really and truly cannot support a family, even on 2 minimum wage jobs, working full-time, year-round, 50 weeks a year. It just doesn't, it really, truly, the economics don't work out. Now, that doesn't mean that employers aren't crunched when minimum wages go up, right? Typically, economic studies find that if minimum wages are increased gradually, as New York State has been doing over the past couple of years, employers can work with that. They can plan. They face that crunch. If the jump were very sudden and very high, then employers would see a real crunch. But with slow increases to reflect the very real costs of living increases that workers are seeing, employers are generally able to manage that.
Well, during the week, we've been talking a lot about the division within the country and how it seems to be accelerating. It seems to be more pronounced now than it has been in the past. And I've talked to some guests about how the media has constantly bombarded us with messages of racism and violence and division, all our differences. When I went to school, when I was growing up, I went to a public school here in Buffalo, and our studies in history and social studies, we were taught, now this was a long time ago, we were taught about how America was a melting pot, and we all came together with the same values and the same goals, and we were one country standing together, and that made us a very strong, productive country. The image is that now it's more about diversity, how our differences, and being proud of our differences and accenting how we're different. And there are a lot of groups in society that are separate. First, is that true? Is my perception true? And second, if it is true, is that productive? Is that a good thing or not a good thing?
Okay, so there's a lot in there of what you just said. So it's absolutely true that, you know, when we were growing up, we were taught that we're this great big melting pot, and that we can come together as one. That's what we were taught, but that's not really a reflection of reality. So while many, particularly white, middle class or upper middle class people experience that in very real ways, and some immigrants who you know, immigrated in the early 20th century did experience that kind of assimilation that we were taught was possible, and that kind of melting potting thing. So many other people haven't. And so that image of unity was kind of at the expense of dismissing other people's experiences. So the story of racism is dominating the news, newly, right? But the experience of racism is not new. That's been going on for a long time. And so it's true that we are in this moment of very significant divisiveness and contention. And that's kind of at the center. And that is a dominant story in the media. But the feeling of divisiveness for some people is not new. For minoritized people in our community, poor communities, many immigrant communities, racialized others, Black people, that experience of feeling like you don't belong, that you're not treated well, that you play by the rules and yet you're not getting ahead, that's not new at all. That's a very old story.
Okay, as I said, it goes by quickly and we are out of time already on this segment. But I want to get into this part of the discussion again, because this is interesting, it's very important. So yeah, stay tuned. We will be back in just a minute, and we're going to continue this part of the discussion. Welcome back to the show. I'm with Dr. Erin Hatton, professor of sociology at UB, and we're having an interesting discussion about all things cultural in the country. And we were talking about division, and we were talking about racism, and the message that the media gives us, and the message that our political leaders give us. And there is no doubt that there is division in the country. There is no doubt that some groups have it better than other groups, and some groups feel the result of discrimination and lesser opportunity. I am not sure, and I can't speak from experience, because first of all, I don't think that way, and I haven't experienced anything that way, but that's me, and I'm a white male. I mean, so I don't fall under some of the classifications that are being affected. But I question whether or not the division and the differences, the discrimination, all the bad part is as prevalent as the message that's bombarded every night from the news and from the political leaders. And I wonder whether all those speeches and all those stories that we hear all the time play a part in promoting the divisiveness as opposed to solving any problems? Is it as bad as what we're told?
I think it is.
Okay.
I think it is. Now, does that solve the problem? Well, that's an open question, right? How do we come back from a situation where we are so divided, where some groups face small discrimination and large discrimination and violence on a regular basis? You know, I mean, police brutality, not all police do it, right? Like it's not for everyone, but it's documented that Black and brown people experience police brutality regularly, disproportionately. And this is not new. This has been going on for a long time. So how does that community find safety when they have no one to call? When there's violence on their street, where do they turn? I think so the problems are very deep, and so it is very hard to figure out how to come back. So in this moment, it's true, we are really focusing on these deep and prolonged and really important and seemingly intractable problems. And I can understand how, if you haven't experienced that, it may seem distant, or you might question it, or you don't know where to go from here. But I think that, you know, in any kind of situation where there are deep problems, one of the first big things you have to do is you've got to get them out in the open. You've got to have a really frank discussion about what's happening now, and what has been happening, you got to put your truth on the table, and then figure out how to move forward from there.
Well, you know, as a member of the media, and I have been since my college days, I've worked in television news. I look at numbers and statistics and the way the media comports itself. I look at how stories are done, and I find myself almost embarrassed sometimes at the way the media is biased, quite frankly. And more the population sees the bias and is less and less trusting of the media. There are stories that I can point out that make for good, you know, press, but they're not necessarily reflective of what's actually out there. For instance, one of my guests earlier in the week is a psychiatrist who worked the prison system, and I asked him about the prevalence of violence and crime. And he corrected me, and he actually said, well, over the last 40 years, the crime rate has steadily gone down. You wouldn't know that from what we're hearing in the media.
That's true. That's absolutely true. There's no doubt that, as you know, the media focuses on sensational stories. And that means, especially when it comes to things like crime or like, I don't know, things like kidnapping, right? Those things are hyped in the news in a way that makes parents scared for their children unreasonably, right? It just is not reflective of reality. So there's no doubt that there's sensationalism going on. But I think the data would show that, you know, the police brutality against racial minorities, particularly Black people, is very real and is very ongoing, and it's not a bad apple scenario necessarily. No, all cops don't do it, but you know, and this isn't my field of specialty, but I have read studies that show that police training promotes kind of from the ground up an us versus them mentality. Not Black people per se, but criminals. And who is criminalized in our society? Black men. They're the pictures that we see in the media of the criminal. Whereas when you look at headlines of a white man who has done something wrong, a criminal, they're not shown in the same way. Like studies show these differences. This is very much based in evidence. So there is something in the structure. It's not just a bad cop here and there, though they may be as well, but this us versus them, this this targeting, this thin blue line, like we need to protect the us from the them. That's division, and that's promoting division, and that's part of the problem.
Well, let's get back into your expertise, your area, and that's the education. And you know, with especially college-educated kids today, the direction that they're going in terms of when they graduate. In society today, what do you think, compared to past generations, what do you think is the direction that graduates are pursuing in terms, I mean, in past it was more of a hands-on job market with manufacturing and skills, and today it's more computers and social media and white-collar jobs. Is that pretty much where young people are going today?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that there's great diversity. Healthcare is another field that a lot of young people are going into. They recognize it as a field that's, you know, not going to go digital overnight, that it's growing. But of course, many young people come into college with the plan to pursue a particular path so that they can get a job, and then they learn, as many, you know, young people do, they're trying things out. That's not the path for them. Oh, they don't want to be a nurse, or they don't want to be an engineer or computer scientist. And so it's a bit hard when they both realize that their whole plan is gone out the window. And maybe the job market falls, or maybe suddenly, you know, they've been taught to go STEM, STEM, STEM their whole childhood. And that was really pressed for a long time. And now suddenly it's oversaturated. So I think there's some confusion about where they're going to go. And I think that confusion in part is very natural. They're young, they're figuring things out. You know, so many students come in at age 17, 18, they don't know. I certainly didn't know.
As a professor of sociology, what do you cover in your classes? What does your study cover for you know, students?
Well, so sociology is very broad. It's the study of society. So it depends on the particular class. In my classes, I teach classes on work and economy. I teach classes on wealth and poverty. I teach classes on gender. What else? I'm trying to think. So inequality. Inequality is often the center of sociology. In some way or other, we look at patterns across populations, what different groups are doing and how those patterns have changed over time.
Do you find that students are more knowledgeable today about the world, or less knowledgeable today about the world as they reach your level of teaching?
That's a good question. I think that there's, I think some students are certainly more knowledgeable than they used to be. They're quite politically engaged and otherwise engaged in the world. And then some students are just kind of like they've always been, not super political, not super engaged in what's going on in the world. And then their eyes really open up when they start to learn about it.
Yeah, interesting. Very good. It's a different world from when we grew up, and for sure, and it's a challenging world. There are a lot of things that we never had to deal with.
That's right.
Especially because of the internet and computers, and they are exposed to a lot more than not necessarily good things either. A lot more knowledge, but you can't really verify what you're looking at.
That's right. It's kind of the wild, wild west out there. Yeah. It's completely unregulated. They're bombarded with all sorts of things, with advertisements, with real news, with fake news, with slanted news, all sorts of things. You know, we see teens with body image issues. There's so much that they get bombarded with. It's really hard to wade through.
A lot more complicated world.
It's very.
Well, that just about does it. I want to thank Dr. Hatton and all the guests I've had this week for contributing to this discussion. Our nation has been a magnificent presence in this world for almost 250 years. In wrapping up, I'd like to leave you with a quote from one of those great leaders of our past. It goes something like this: Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasures of the earth in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reaches us, it must spring from amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Abraham Lincoln, January 27th, 1838.